right, welcome everybody. Good evening, how are we doing? Just excellent, nice to see you all. I'm very impressed, it's 70 degrees and you're inside, so bless you. We've spent a long time working on this great event. We're so delighted to have Michael Waldman here, but I do know the weather is very, very enticing. Welcome to CSREA's annual Third Rail Lecture. For those of you who don't know what CSREA is about, some of you I recognize, but some seem like you haven't been at too many CSREA events. We're a campus-wide research center devoted to the study of race and ethnicity in America. We try to build scholarly community across various disciplines, foster public conversations, and enhance knowledge on pivotal issues, and hopefully, this is our aspiration, contribute to the national and local community efforts to create a more just society. But the Third Rail Lecture Series is a very special part of our mission. It features respected scholars and researchers who can accessibly address some of the most thorny and contentious political, social, and cultural issues related to race and ethnicity in contemporary society. Obviously, voting rights is one of these topics, along with affirmative action, welfare policy, and things in immigration law. These are the kinds of topics we like to tackle with the Third Rail Lecture Series. So we're very lucky to have Michael Waldman here tonight to give our third annual Third Rail Lecture Series on his new book called The Fight to Vote. Before I go any further, though, I want to extend a very special thanks to Jody Rich and to Brad Brockman, who recommended Michael Waldman, who I've known for years on Twitter and the TV and following the Brennan Center. A number of my ex-students have been employed by your unit. But I was really thrilled for them to consider a faculty research grant to bring him. And I said, no, he's third rail material. We're going to move him right on out of the grants into third rail. So I want to thank them both for bringing us together. Tonight, after Mr. Waldman speaks, we'll have a brief Q&A. There's going to be a lovely reception and a book signing. And tomorrow, for those of you who have time, in the morning, there's a research seminar called Digging for Democracy, Using Archival Research to Tell America's Story. And this will be from 10 to 11:30 in Pembroke Hall, room 202. 10 to 11:30 tomorrow, research seminar on using archives to tell America's story. So let me give a brief introduction to Michael Waldman. I'd be here a very long time if I told you all the things he's done, so you'll have to Google him for the full scope. But for the moment, Michael Waldman is the president of the Brennan Center for Justice at the NYU School of Law, a nonpartisan law and policy institute that focuses on improving the systems of democracy and justice. He's a constitutional lawyer and writer and an expert on the presidency and American democracy. The Brennan Center is a leading legal voice on election law, constitutional law, government reform, and racial justice. In 2012, it helped lead the successful effort to block laws that could have made it harder for 5 million eligible citizens to vote. Waldman has led the center since 2005. He's the author of The Fight to Vote, newly published, on the history of the long struggle to win voting rights for all Americans. It's receiving widespread praise for its masterful and compelling treatment over the struggle over voting rights in the U.S. history. He's the author of several previous books, The Second Amendment, A Return to Common Sense, POTUS Speaks, Who Robbed America? That's a long book, I'm sure. And The Citizen's Guide to the SNL Scandal. But Mr. Waldman also appears frequently on television and radio to discuss public policy, the presidency, and the law, and writes frequently not only in these longer texts, but in media outlets such as the New York Times, Politico, Washington Post, among others. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Michael Waldman to Brown.
Thank you, Professor Rose. It is just such a wonderful honor and treat for me to be here at Brown, to be here with you talking about this incredibly important topic. The work you do and that the center does is so vital and so much at the heart of what is troubling the country, and so much at the center of our thoughts, and so much of part of why I'm hopeful about the direction of justice and democracy and equality in America. It's really a great pleasure to be with you, and thank you to Professor Jody Rich and Brad, and to see so many people I know, because it's a treat also to see Susanna, my daughter, who works with all of you on so many of these issues. It's a great thing to be here. And the Brennan Center gives me the privilege of working on these issues of racial justice, of equality, of making sure that the institutions actually live up to our ideals every day. I actually get to work on this in a tangible way day in and day out. And that is a kind of thing that is rare and really lucky. I'll be talking a little bit about it tomorrow in how we use the ability to dig through the archives of American history, especially online, to make our case. The Brennan Center is sort of partly a think tank, and it's partly a legal advocacy group, and it's partly a communications hub. And we work, as we see it, on reforming and revitalizing the systems of democracy and justice in America so that they live up to these basic ideals. We were started by the clerks and the family of the late, great Supreme Court Justice William Brennan 20 years ago after he left the bench. And he was one of the leading progressive civil rights and civil liberties justices in American history. We don't follow his decisions to the letter, but we try to follow his spirit. He believed, first off, that the heart of the law was an essential concept of human dignity, and that the Constitution, as he saw it, should not be read as a static document, but as a living document, something that had to fit the needs and address the concerns of each generation. So that's what we do at the Brennan Center. We work, as the professor said, on criminal justice reform and mass incarceration. We're very focused on and part of the drive to address the fact that, as you know undoubtedly, we have 5% of the world's population and 25% of the world's prison population, with massive racial, economic, and social consequences. We work also on dealing with the egregious growing role of big money in American politics. We are leading the constitutional jurisprudential drive to actually overturn Citizens United and other misguided Supreme Court decisions over the next 10 years, fighting for constitutional change in that context. And probably most prominently, we work on this issue of the right to vote and making sure that every eligible American actually has the ability to cast a ballot, to have that vote mean something, to have our democracy work. And that's why I wrote this book. People say, well, why did you do this now? It's a very challenging time for our democracy. In so many ways, the institutions of American governance feel as if they're under siege, and that was true and certainly felt true even before this election. This presidential election, this year, we're going to have in 17 states new laws on the books that make it harder for people to vote for the first time in a high turnout national election. 17 states for the first time. It's the first time to have that since the Jim Crow era. It's the first presidential election in half a century without the full strength protection of the Voting Rights Act. And that comes also at a time when there are numerous other challenges to the vote and to the power and the meaning of that vote. I mentioned Citizens United. It's changed the role of money in American politics in new and disturbing ways. In the last election, 2014, the top 100 donors gave more than the 4.75 million small donors combined. That is a level of concentrated political wealth we have not seen since the Gilded Age in the United States. Add to that the problems of gerrymandering, the drawing of the lines to entrench political parties or incumbents, the general decrepitude of the way our voting machines and everything else work. In many, many ways, the institutions of American democracy are ailing. And it's not a surprise that in the last election, voter turnout plunged to its lowest level in 72 years. And that was during World War II, when a lot of people were overseas. So it's really, they had an excuse, at least, and we don't. The question that I wanted to ask, the question that I wanted to understand, the question I wanted to teach people about and write about was, why is this happening now? And has it always been this way? And looking back, as this book does, on the whole sweep of American history and what it can teach us about today, these fights, the fact that people have to fight to exercise their right to vote, these fights are consequential and they are fierce, but they are not new. In fact, this fight to vote has been at the heart of American history from the very beginning. It's been at the center of debates from the very beginning. It's very often been in the middle of partisan political contests from the very beginning. At every step of the way, some Americans have had to demand their place at the table, have had to insist on their full participation in our democracy. And at every step of the way, others have fought to stop them. And it turns out that, of course, first of all, no surprise, given what you all study here, this emphatically touches in profound ways on the issues of race, ethnicity, and identity in our country. It also goes to issues beyond that, in that we've always understood that issues of wealth and economic power are also inextricably bound up with the meaningful vote, a meaningful democracy. We've understood from the beginning, going back again to the start, that the formal right to vote, as important as it is, means not a whole lot if there is the ability to manipulate the rules so that that right loses its effectiveness. And it's interestingly been the case, too, at this moment, that it has been a fight waged very often not only by citizens demanding their voice be heard, or even activists working to organize social change, but just as often, and in somewhat surprising ways, political insiders, partisans, who are often acting for cynical or self-interested reasons, but have actually played an unusual and surprising role in the expansion of democracy. So that is, in so many ways, the great American story. We were the first nation, certainly on a continent-wide scale, that would come close to considering itself a democracy. But we've had to struggle to recreate that democracy in every generation. It started, as I said, at the very beginning. The book starts with the Declaration of Independence, with all of its contradictions. It starts with Thomas Jefferson writing the Declaration of Independence, sitting there writing that government was legitimate only, as he wrote, when it rests on the consent of the governed. And of course, at the moment he's writing that, he is being attended to by a 14-year-old slave boy named Bob Hemmings, Sally Hemings' brother. The contradictions were there, but the power of the idea of consent of the governed as the basis of American institutions was very powerful. And even though it was not the reality then, even though they knew it was not the reality then, it took on a life of its own and was something to which people could appeal endlessly as an aspiration. Now, the rule at the time was that only white men who owned property could vote. That was it. That was the rule handed down from England. It was basically a tradition. Each of the colonies and then each of the states, they were independent states, could set their own rules. But that was by and large the rule. But even then, and voting, I should say, I'm going to constantly come back to Rhode Island and its checkered role in American history on these issues. Voting was, not many people voted. There was a lot of violence. There was a lot of fraud and corruption. And stealing elections in the period before the revolution was known as Rhode Islandism, because it was so colorful here and was so advanced a practice. Even then, the idea that only white men who owned property could vote was controversial. The book, one of the things that was fun for me, because I work on these issues day in and day out in fighting for voting rights, but I learned a lot about the kind of heroes and villains of American history, and some of them were people I'd heard of or that we'd all heard of, playing maybe new roles, and others were people I didn't know anything about. Ben Franklin was one of them. In 1776, Ben Franklin led a working man's revolt in Pennsylvania, where the non-property owning men of the newly independent state demanded voting rights and demanded an end to the property requirement. It was one of the only places where the revolution really looked like what we would think of as like a revolution, you know, the crowds, angry crowds kind of storming the State House. And Ben Franklin led this. He wrote the Constitution of the new state of Pennsylvania that had no property requirement for voting. And he said, this is the argument he made, he said, there's a man who owns a jackass worth $50. The jackass, so he can vote. The jackass dies. The man is older, he is wiser, he has better knowledge of government, but the jackass is dead, so the man cannot vote. Who, therefore, he asked, has the right of suffrage, the man or his jackass? That seemed pretty persuasive to people. So they ended the property requirement in Pennsylvania. John Adams, one of the other founders, spoke for a different tradition. He was aghast at the idea of wider voting rights because he saw precisely what it meant and what would happen. He said, new claims will arise. He was urged to do this up in Massachusetts. He said, women will demand the right to vote. Lads will think their interests insufficiently attended to, and they will demand the right to vote. And men, he said, who hath not a farthing to their name will think themselves worthy of an equal voice in government, and they will demand a right to vote. He said, there will be no end of it. And that's exactly what happened. That's a fairly decent summary of the book, but also of the next 240 years of American history. The idea of democracy built and built. And the very first breakthrough for a wider suffrage in the United States came with the movement to end that property requirement for voting. And it's really interesting. Given the context of today's political debates, the very first voting rights victory in the United States was won by angry white working class men, people who today might be voting for Donald Trump. And it was in the period known as Jacksonian democracy. The property requirement was ended. And this is one of the places where I say that the interplay between activism and citizen empowerment and politicians and political parties can offer surprises, because the institution that waged and won this fight was the Democratic Party, the new political party, which was the first mass political party in the world. And one of the leading figures was the governor of New York, Martin Van Buren. And now Martin Van Buren was no firebrand. He was kind of legendary. He was called the Little Magician, and he was kind of a legendarily slippery figure. One of the state senators bet another one in Albany. He said, I will bet you that I can get Van Buren to give a straight answer to a simple question. And he took the bet, and he went up to Van Buren, and he said, Mr. Van Buren, is it true that the sun rises in the east? And Van Buren said, seeing as how I never arise that early, I cannot speak from my personal experience, so I don't know the answer to that. But he was the person who fought in very passionate terms to expand voting rights. You saw in states all across the country, in the new states coming in, that there was now an idea that democracy, to be legitimate, needed to rest on a much wider base of support and participation. And democracy and voting became almost a fad. It became very, very deeply participatory, something that people without education, without money, spent a great deal of their energy and time on. But one of the things that won't surprise you as you look at the history is it is not all in one direction. It's quite complex. First of all, in a few places that had women or African Americans being able to vote during this time withdrew that right. New Jersey. In New Jersey, women were allowed to vote until 1809. And there was voter fraud. Some men dressed up as women and went from polling place to polling place. So given this voter fraud, of course, what they did was they disenfranchised the actual women, not the men dressed as women. But that was withdrawn. And in other places where black men were allowed to vote, that was pretty much taken away also as slavery became even more and more entrenched in the 1800s. And one of the last places and one of the great fights over this fight for the right to vote for those without property actually took place here in Providence. I don't know if anybody's heard of this. Have you heard of the Dorr War? So in 1841, there's some Dorr War fans over there, but probably most people haven't heard of it. I had not heard of it. So as I said, by the 1840s, the idea that only the wealthy could be trusted with the ballot was gone. But Rhode Island was the holdout. They still used the charter that the British king had given the state, and only white men who owned property could vote. And people argued that that violated the Constitution, and there was a movement to change that. And it was led by a guy named Thomas Dorr, who was a wealthy son of a factory owner, went to Harvard. He was very passionate. He also was sort of full of himself and saw himself as the leader of what was called the People's Party. And they created their own constitutional convention and staged their own election without a property requirement, and voted for a new constitution that did not have the property requirement. This was in 1841. But it gets interesting and complicated. Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist, just starting his career. He was an escaped slave, an incredibly brilliant thinker and orator up in Massachusetts, made his first trip out of Massachusetts to Providence to get involved in this fight. And he asked to speak to the People's Convention, and they told him no. And their version of voting rights excluded African American men. So he came and sided with what was called the Law and Order Party, because it turned out there already was a governor. Dorr was elected governor, but there was another guy who was already the governor. So there were two governments here in Rhode Island. So Dorr went off on the road. He went down to Washington to meet with the president, John Tyler, and to ask them to recognize and send troops and recognize the new government of Rhode Island, which was on the verge of a civil war. And Tyler was from Virginia, and the last thing they wanted was the federal government meddling in voting rights in the states. So he sent him off. And Dorr was very despondent. And he went up to New York, and in New York he was hailed by, in theaters and by the Democratic Party machine there. And he kind of got his energy back, and he came back to Providence and arrived at the train station waving a sword and declaring that they were going to seize power. And they stole some cannons and brought them across the cobblestone streets to assault the state armory on behalf of voting rights. And they fired the cannons, and it was raining, and they didn't work. And they were quickly routed, and he had to leave the state. And he was eventually arrested for treason to Rhode Island was the crime, and imprisoned. The Supreme Court, among other things, one of the other threads is that, with very rare exceptions, the courts, and especially the Supreme Court, have stayed out of the fight for democracy in America. For those of us who are lawyers, this is a bit of a surprise. We revere the institution. We think of it as the bulwark of liberty, but it stayed the hell out of the issue of democracy, especially starting with the Dorr War, where they issued a ruling called Luther versus Borden, which said that if something was a political question, they were just going to stay out of it. So the Dorr War was a little bit of a comic opera interlude, but this idea that democracy was the way to go became sort of at the heart of Americans' sense of themselves. And of course, it called the question of who was excluded from that. And that led to the next great fight over voting and voting rights, which was the aftermath of slavery and African Americans. The Civil War changed so many things, and one of the lessons throughout history is that it's frequently military conflict that has helped lead to the expansion of voting rights for a lot of different reasons, including people demanding and deserving their seat at the table because they've served in the military. At the end of the Civil War, Frederick Douglass and the other abolitionists said, now the next fight is to enfranchise the former slaves. And Abraham Lincoln was against this. Lincoln had always been against voting rights for African American men. He'd been publicly against it. But the war changed Lincoln on this as on so many other things. By the end of the Civil War, 1 in 10 Union soldiers was a black man. When Lincoln gave his famous second inaugural address, half the audience were African American men and women, many of them in uniform. And Lincoln was moved and changed, and his original plans for Reconstruction did not enfranchise the former slaves. But 3 days after the surrender at Appomattox in April of 1865, Lincoln gave a speech from the second floor window of the White House, where he set out for the first time in detail his plans for Reconstruction. And it was a long speech, but in the middle of the speech he said, by the way, I've been criticized for not extending the right to vote to black men, and I now agree with this criticism. I think that those who've served in the military, who are educated, should have the right to vote. And actually at a cabinet meeting, he indicated he was going to go all the way, that he was going to go further. And I say it was a long speech. At least one person in the audience understood the significance of what Lincoln said. John Wilkes Booth was there. And historians tell us that he gasped and said, that means citizenship. That is the last speech he will ever give. And when Lincoln said that about voting, Booth tried to get the guy standing next to him to shoot Lincoln on the spot. And he refused, so Booth vowed, well, then I will put him through myself. And 2 days later, went to Ford's Theater and did that. And Booth, I'm not saying Booth was a big fan of Abraham Lincoln before that. The previous plan had been to kidnap him, which didn't seem like a very workable scheme. But it was the spark that led him to murder. And this issue of voting rights for black men was at the heart of American politics and at the heart of their debates over Reconstruction in a way that we don't really realize. The 13th Amendment, ending slavery, had left in place the provision of the Constitution that said that African Americans were only 3/5 of a person. So what that meant was the southern states were not enfranchising those people, but they still were counting. And when the southern states came back into the Union, they would once again have the ability to take it over and dominate. The 14th Amendment tried to address that. In one of the provisions, we know the 14th Amendment with its grand phrases about equal protection of the law and due process, but to them, one of the big parts of it that they thought was going to be most significant was it said, to the extent that you disenfranchise voters, you lose representation in Congress. But even that wasn't enough. So in the 15th Amendment, the Republican Party pushed through a constitutional provision prohibiting discrimination in voting based on race. It was very much a mix of idealism and party politics. Again, the identity of which party is kind of the good guy and the bad guy in this changes around a lot. The Republican Party was the pro-voting rights party for most of American history, and certainly at that moment. And what many people forgot for many years, and even now many people don't know, is the 15th Amendment for a while was massively successful. There was a flowering of democracy in the South. Voter participation rates among black men reached 90%. Hundreds were elected to legislatures, to Congress, as lieutenant governor, as governor, as senator from southern states. And then, as you undoubtedly know, it was crushed. First by violence, by terrorism, by the Ku Klux Klan and the Knights of the White Camellia and other terrorist groups. The Klan was basically an auxiliary, a military auxiliary of the Democratic Party. The Republican Party and the Union troops were there to defend the voting rights, but the Klan was working for the Democrats and terrorized black voters in the South and really drove people away from the polls. And then there was a cowardly deal where the North basically gave up. And in exchange for the White House, the Republican Party agreed that it would withdraw the troops. And as you know, the Jim Crow era followed. There was a suppression of the vote by black men, gradual at first, and then in the 1890s in the constitutions of the southern states. And it was almost a complete withdrawal of the right to vote. And that fact, that solid South, as it was called, of an all-white Democratic Party with very little democracy, very little democratic participation at all in the South, was the central fact in American government for decades and decades and decades, basically well until my lifetime. And that story was, was covered up in many significant ways. It was only really rediscovered by historians like C. Vann Woodward and John Hope Franklin and others during the Civil Rights era to realize the true story of Reconstruction. What a lot of people don't realize is something similar happened in the North. Not as bad, but there was a similar crackdown on voting rights because of new waves of immigrants and new demographic change and new forms of ethnicity and religion. The northern cities were now filled with immigrants. They were not from Mexico, the way you might hear people talking about today. They were from Ireland and Italy and Russia and Europe. But the established sort of blue blood elite of the time had so many of the same anxieties about demographic change and voting by immigrants that you might hear today. John Adams' great-grandson said that universal suffrage will lead to the dictatorship of the Celtic proletariat in the North, the African proletariat in the South, and the Chinese proletariat in the West. The editor of The Nation magazine was a strong opponent of voting rights and thought they should reinstate the property requirement. Walt Whitman wrote articles opposing democracy because they were so worried about what the immigrants were going to do. And they put in place a bunch of policies to make it harder in the North and the West for working class people and immigrants to vote. Some of them kind of look neutral on their face. Like the existence of voter registration was only applied to cities, not in the countryside, because the cities were where the Democrats and the immigrants were. California, the California Constitution said that nobody born in China could vote. And that was a very big part of the population. And the courts ruled that that did not violate the 15th Amendment because it wasn't about race. It was about where you were born. Theoretically, a missionary who was born in China could come home and they couldn't vote either. It was transparently absurd. But the 15th Amendment was riddled with loopholes like this, and they knew it at the time. And it was never used to strike down the Jim Crow laws of that period. So the late 1800s is a really important period for us to understand. Democracy in America does not only move in one direction. It's broadly expanded, it's broadly been strengthened, but there have been times where it's moved backwards. And the late 1800s was a very big moment in that way. Adding to this, another new factor, which will be familiar to us now, which was the role of money in politics, which had previously not been significant. But the flood of money from the Gilded Age robber barons, which became how they paid for campaigns and made the vote less meaningful and introduced a great deal of corruption. So things went backwards. The period right after that is another moment which might offer lessons for us today. We call it the Progressive Era, and it doesn't get as much attention as a lot of other times. The Progressive Era was this response to the corruption and the inequality of the Gilded Age in America. And we know about it as the time when government first began doing things and they passed food and drug regulation and other antitrust laws, the beginnings of the modern state. But to the Americans of the time, they saw expanding the vote and expanding democracy as a critical response to what they'd seen as the degradation of American democracy. They felt government was rigged. They felt that their votes didn't count, that big money was dominating, that demographic and economic change was surging around them, and that the institutions of public life weren't keeping up. It was a very similar set of concerns to today, and they felt that restoring and revitalizing democracy was one of the key answers. One of the amendments to the Constitution that dealt with this, I mentioned that the courts did not play a big role throughout most of American history. There were actually, and the original Constitution did not refer to the right to vote, but there have been 5 separate constitutional amendments that explicitly talk about there being a right to vote, and others that basically are talking about that. One of them was the 17th Amendment, which we don't give much attention to. That was the one that said that you have the right to vote for senator. Previously, senators had been chosen by the state legislature of the states, and that was their version of campaign finance reform, because they felt that the state legislatures were corrupt and owned by, as they said, the interests. And back to Rhode Island, one of the key things was a really well-known article, muckraking article called State for Sale, about how corrupt politics were in Rhode Island as one of the rationales for why you needed a 17th Amendment. The other great breakthrough for democracy during the progressive era is something we kind of tend to skip over. It's the 19th Amendment, giving the right to vote to women, in which women won the right to vote. And I say we skip over it because even I just did, I sort of implied that it was given to the women, right? It turns out, and this is a set of stories that I just did not know, and most of the people who work with me, who work on voting rights and are women, did not know. The fight to vote for women was every bit as fierce and fiercely contested as the voting rights fights that came before and after. So you might know that in 1848 was the Seneca Falls Declaration. That was the sort of the grand statement that women should have the right to vote. But not a whole lot happened after that. For decades, they called it the doldrums. Nothing happened. And it was not until 1911 a group of young women in their 20s decided to take it much further. They had been graduate students, many of them in England, where the suffrage movement was very controversial and very dramatic and intense and violent. And they were over there and they came back, and there were just a handful of them, and they were in their late 20s, and they said, we're going to do something bold and audacious. We're going to actually pass a constitutional amendment to extend the right to vote to women. And the older women in the suffrage movement weren't so wild, were emphatically not wild about this. They kind of let them go do their thing. 3 months later, after they started this, Woodrow Wilson got off the train in Washington, D.C., the day before his inauguration as President of the United States. And he expected to be greeted by a big throng, and he looked around, and there was nobody there, basically nobody there. There was the Princeton Glee Club, and that was it. And they belted out a song, and the New York Times reported that they made up in enthusiasm what they lacked in numbers. You know, the Times was a good Democratic paper, even then. And finally, Wilson's aide said, where are all the people? And the host sort of sheepishly explained that they were all down at Pennsylvania Avenue where there was a march for women's voting rights for the 19th Amendment. 5,000 women marching down Pennsylvania Avenue, led by, on a white horse, a young woman, a 27-year-old woman named Inez Milholland. She was on a white horse, dressed as a Greek goddess, carrying a banner at the head of the parade. And I was especially struck by this because she was a recent graduate of NYU Law School, who was very active in radical legal circles in New York at the time. But Inez Milholland was leading the parade on her horse, and 5,000 women. And surrounding them on either side were 100,000 men, many of them drunk. They were there for the inaugural. And the men began throwing things, cursing, spitting. They broke through the lines and assaulted the women. They beat them up. 100 women were sent to the hospital. They had to fight their way down to the end of Pennsylvania Avenue. This was a big deal. It was massively covered. It sort of overshadowed the coverage of the inauguration. The police chief of Washington, D.C. had to resign. There were investigations, and public opinion swung for the first time in support of women's voting rights because of this publicized violence directed against a march of peaceful citizens demanding their right. And of course, I read about this, and everybody hears about this and says, that sounds just like Selma. It was 50 years before Selma, and it was basically the same dynamic. And it still took 4 more years to get the 19th Amendment passed. And so many of the tactics and strategies of protest were pioneered and originated by those women. And it's important, again, the complexity of this, to note that history is not all heroes and villains and not all morally unambiguous. That black women were told they could not march at the front of the parade by the organizers. And Ida B. Wells, the great journalist from Chicago, said, I'm ignoring that, and jumped into the parade from the side, but had been ordered not to. And because they felt that with a Democratic president whose political base was the segregationist South, they could not have an integrated parade. And the tactics that they used included, they picketed the White House for 2 years straight, hunger strikes, they formed a political party, there were referenda, all these things that were used later. And in 1920, the 19th Amendment was ratified. And it's an amazing thing. This was before Gandhi used these things. These are the Martin Luther King and John Lewis of that movement, and they're unknown to almost everybody today who works on voting rights. Inez Milholland, there was a civil liberties professor at NYU Law School who until quite recently was the Inez Milholland professor of civil liberties, and frankly, neither he nor anybody else, nor we, knew who she was. We thought she was a donor to the law school. And imagine my surprise when she was on this white horse. The fight for voting rights in many ways took a back seat after that to the other expansions of democracy and expansions of equality, economic equality, that you had during the New Deal. But again, World War II especially began to empower the returning veterans who were black, and the armed forces were formally desegregated after that. And that helped, again, to create pressure as part of the civil rights movement to win the greatest victory of all, which was the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And I won't go into too much detail on that because that's a story that's better known. The Voting Rights Act was so important not only because of the way it guaranteed meaningfully the right to vote for African Americans, but it signaled a whole wave of democratizing changes so that non-English speakers and immigrants were really effectively guaranteed the right to vote. The Constitution was amended to end the poll tax, which was one of the Jim Crow devices used to keep African Americans from voting, but also affected poor whites. The voting age was lowered to 18, just as John Adams worried it would be. The story of Selma and of the Voting Rights Act, you know that there was incredible suppression of the vote, that there were courageous citizens who marched on Edmund Pettus Bridge in the worst place in the South to try to vote, who were met with violence from the police and the white community. And you know that they were organized by locals and by national groups that came in, led by Dr. King, in a conscious effort to dramatize for the country the fight. And you know that this led to an explosion of public disgust and pressure that led eventually to Lyndon Johnson a week later going before Congress and saying to them, embracing the slogan of the civil rights movement, "We shall overcome." And I can talk about it, but there's a lot of debate over sort of what level of responsibility different actors have. I mean, it turns out that the interplay between Johnson and King is so much more interesting than the movie Selma made it. How many of you have seen the movie Selma? That was, I thought, a very one-dimensional portrayal of Johnson especially. And what's interesting is so many of the conversations between King and Johnson were taped. And there are these two brilliant politicians circling around each other, neither telling the full story. They met 3 days before Selma. Johnson never told King that he'd, over the objection of his Justice Department, ordered them to draft the Voting Rights Act and that they'd negotiated it already with the Republicans. And King never told Johnson, by the way, on Sunday, turn on your TV, we're marching in Selma. They sort of talked past each other, but it was an incredible moment. And unlike the Reconstruction of the 1800s, it worked. Voting rights in Mississippi, for example, African American registration rates went from 7% in 1964 to 60% 4 years later, to 78% by 1998. And so for me, when I was your age, these issues were done. Put your pencils down. This was not a particularly controversial topic. Everybody agreed, one person, one vote, that's how it should be done. A lot has changed in the last 15 years, and I'll quickly run through it. I mentioned at the beginning that we're in an intense time, starting with the recount in Florida in 2000, where the election came down to one state and it was basically a tie. And people realized, partisans realized, that you could really win in a presidential election based not just on the arguments you make to the swing voters, but if you could turn out your vote or suppress the other side's vote, even in marginal ways, it could make a big difference. And Florida was a mess. It showed that how easy it was to manipulate the system. There were all kinds of problems, but among the bottom line findings is that millions of people showed up to vote and either couldn't vote or voted and they thought their vote was going for somebody else, but that African Americans were 4 times more likely to have their ballots rejected for whatever reason than white voters in Florida. And that fact alone elected George W. Bush president, assuming voting patterns to be what they were. There began to be a concerted political strategy to restrict voting rights in a way we had not seen in a long time. And I say, you know, sometimes one party or another is the good guy, a bad guy. This is a conservative Republican Party strategy to assert that there's a great deal of voter fraud, which is nonsensical. As a statistical matter, the only type of voter fraud that any of these new laws would touch is in-person impersonation at the polling place. And as a statistical matter, you are more likely to be hit by lightning in the United States than to commit in-person voter impersonation. Everybody agrees with that. But it built and built. There was a scandal that a lot of people don't remember under George W. Bush, where the top United States government prosecutors all over the country were fired, and nobody knew why, and it turned out that they were fired in many instances because they'd been ordered by the White House or the senior political appointees at the Justice Department to bring voter fraud cases where there wasn't any evidence of voter fraud. And when these Republican prosecutors refused, they were fired. And this was a big, brief, quickly forgotten scandal. The Attorney General of the United States, Alberto Gonzales, had to resign in the scandal. But at the same time that there was this new effort to restrict the vote, and bound up with it, there was surging changes in the makeup of the electorate and the demography of the country. So a rapid increase, as we all know, in voting by people of color, culminating in the campaign of 2008, the election of Barack Obama. And very polarized racial voting patterns that happened even before Obama ran. But now the share of the electorate that was communities of color was growing and growing. And that led to more and more, in effect, panic on the part of a lot of white incumbent politicians who were looking for ways to change the rules to make that harder to happen. It was basically held in abeyance until 2011, when a great number of state legislatures changed hands. And as was described by the professor, states all across the country passed new laws to make it harder to vote. These laws were wide in their scope. They cut back on early voting, but especially on the day when African American voters voted, the Sunday before the polls. It's called Souls to the Polls. It's a very widely used day for organizing churches to vote. But cutbacks in early voting, repealing same-day voter registration, laws to make it harder, much harder to wage voter registration drives, which is the way poor people are registered more than anything else. We represented the Brennan Center, the League of Women Voters of Florida, a well-known Trotskyist organization, and it is not. That was a joke. They're wearing pearls, you know, when they go do their voter registration, and they had to shut down their voter registration operation for fear of criminal penalties, basically, if someone made a mistake. And voter ID laws, which you probably have heard about. Now, I should say, I'm not against voter ID. I'm actually for voter ID in the sense that I think there's been a lot of misconduct in elections, and I think it's not crazy for people to have to be who they say they are, and not crazy to ask people to prove it. I'm against, and we fight against, and the Brennan Center is among those leading the fights against, requiring forms of ID that lots of people do not have. And about 11% of eligible voters in the United States don't have a driver's license or the other very specific forms of identification that these new laws, in a very partisan and mischievous way, are requiring. I'll say that Rhode Island passed a voter ID law. It was new, but it had a much wider range of acceptable IDs, and it has not, as far as I know, caused significant disenfranchisement or problems. But that's not what most of these laws did. We went to court, the voting rights groups went to court. We exposed this in public. Our study showing that 5 million people could lose the right to vote was the lead story in the New York Times. It helped to foster a major national debate. And by the time we went to court in the spring of 2012, every one of the worst new laws was blocked or blunted or postponed or repealed. So there really wasn't a problem for people voting in a significant way on Election Day. But then the Supreme Court entered the fray. And I said the Supreme Court has mostly stayed out of it throughout history, not now. Under John Roberts and this 5-vote strongly conservative and interventionist majority, they intervened especially energetically on issues relating to democracy. In 2010, they had done the Citizens United decision, knocking down a century of campaign finance law. And in 2013, they declared unconstitutional the heart of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This had been the most successful civil rights law in American history. It's a case called Shelby County. And the spirit of the decision was articulated by Justice Scalia in the courtroom. He said that he thought that the Voting Rights Act was little more, quote, than a racial entitlement. And people gasped. You can hear it, you can hear the tape. People in the courtroom gasped. He didn't write the opinion. Chief Justice Roberts wrote the opinion. And what Roberts said was this. He said that was, in effect, talking about disenfranchisement in the South, he said that was then, this is now. He pointed out that black voting rates were now higher in the South than white voting rates. And so things, he said, had changed. Ruth Bader Ginsburg wrote a powerful and rather famous now dissent in that case. She said, well, that's like standing in a rainstorm holding an umbrella and saying, well, I'm not getting wet, so therefore I must not need the umbrella, and putting away the umbrella. And she predicted that there would be quickly disenfranchisement that followed. So who was right? So 2 hours after the Shelby County ruling, the state of Texas implemented its new voter ID law. And 608,000 registered voters in Texas, according to federal courts, lost their right to vote 2 hours later. Disproportionately African American and Latino, and also young. And this is kind of a famous law because it's so blatantly crafted. This is the law where you cannot use your University of Texas student ID as your government ID, but you can use your concealed carry gun permit. Who does that help? One of the voters who lost their right to vote 2 hours after the ruling was a woman named Sammy Louise Bates. And she grew up in Mississippi. She remembered counting out the money for her grandmother to pay the poll tax. She moved to Detroit and then Chicago. It's sort of a classic story of the great migration of African Americans from the South to the industrial cities of the North. She went to college. She worked and then she retired and moved to Texas and lives on Social Security and nothing else. She's voted since she was 21. She's done everything right. And she lost the right to vote like that. And we asked her in sworn testimony, why didn't you just get your birth certificate, which she needed to have to get the paperwork? She didn't have a driver's license. And she said, well, that costs $42. I needed to put those $42 where they would do the most good. You can't eat a birth certificate. And she was the lead witness in the federal trial brought by the Brennan Center and the Justice Department and a few other groups. And the judge found, from her testimony and others, that the law was illegal, it was unconstitutional, it was discriminatory, deliberately discriminatory, and said it was overturned. That ruling was upheld last year by the most conservative federal appeals court in the country, and the law is still on the books because the wheels of justice grind very slowly. The state of Texas is taking its sweet time about appealing, and it's still in effect. And all across the country, these laws are going to be in effect now this time for the first time. And we don't know what the impact's going to be, but there's now new data showing that the GAO, the Government Accountability Office, the nonpartisan think tank used by Republicans and Democrats in Congress, reporting to Congress, found that these new voter ID laws do suppress turnout, but not among everybody, among African Americans. So that's the situation now. We don't know what the impact is. There is, however, hope, not only because there's a response, not only because the courts are finally stepping up, and we're waiting for the Supreme Court to again, not only because this is becoming a voting issue, a public issue, but partly because of the understanding of what's going on, there's a simultaneous positive wave of reform to enfranchise more people and to fix the way we register voters and do other things. That's happening at the same moment as these disenfranchising steps. I'll tell you about two things. The biggest change that could happen, that could make the biggest difference, is if we change the way we register voters in the United States. If we had a move to automatic voter registration so that everybody who's eligible to vote is on the rolls, it would add 50 million people to the rolls. It would cost less, and for people who are really worried about fraud, it would stop that too. The Brennan Center first put the proposal out for that about 8 years ago, and it is now very encouragingly in the last year starting to move big all across the country. Oregon, California passed automatic voter registration last year. West Virginia, 3 weeks ago, Republican and Democratic officials, it's a very conservative state, passed it. We think Vermont is going to in the next few days. Illinois is probably going to move on it. President Obama spoke about it in front of the Illinois legislature. People are talking about doing it here, all over the country. This would make a huge difference. And interestingly, it has Republican as well as Democratic support because it just is a much better way to run a railroad. It's how other democracies do it. Our voter registration rolls really are filled with names of dead people and double entries and stuff like errors and stuff like that. So it sort of solves the problems of left and right, and it would enfranchise so many people. The other positive development is also something that happened here in Rhode Island before anywhere else. One of the worst disenfranchisements we have is the denial of the right to vote for people who have had a criminal conviction. It's actually in the Constitution. It's authorized in the 14th Amendment. But the way it's played out is tremendously racially unjust. And as there's an understanding among more and more people about the consequences of mass incarceration, more and more people of left and right see this as one of the ancillary side consequences of that. And there's a move all across the country to fix this. We work very closely on this with the evangelical conservatives. Rand Paul is one of the champions in Congress on this. And in Rhode Island, putting the lie to the idea that voters would be against this, about 8 years ago, the voters of Rhode Island ended felony disenfranchisement in the state. And and these are for people who are back in the community, they're working, they're paying taxes. And a couple of years ago, one of the people who had their voting rights restored, thanks to the Rhode Island law, actually came to work at the Brennan Center as a legal intern because he's in law school now. So this is actually a positive movement where left and right are coming together. So there's a lot happening. We don't know what November is going to be like, but we know this is going to be at the heart of what people are talking about. We know that 3 weeks ago in Maricopa County, Arizona, there were long lines because they closed 70% of the polls where the Voting Rights Act would have stopped it in heavily Hispanic Maricopa County. We know that in Wisconsin, during the primary, there was chaos at the polling place. And we know that New York had all kinds of problems, even predating the current laws. But we also know that people are engaged, they're fighting, they're voting over this. It's easy to kind of get lost in the push and pull and to say, well, sure, some people are always grabbing and others are pushing back, and both sides have some moral equivalence. But I think that the notion embodied in that idea, the consent of the governed, based on political equality, is the heart of the American ideal, is more powerful than that. So John Adams was right. There is no end of it. It's never going to be solved. It's always going to be a fight. It's always going to be a fight that has to be waged by all of us, by all of you, and all of us and all of you are going to have to write the next chapter. So there's a lot to draw on in this history on the fight to vote. So thank you.